Thank you very, very much, and thank you for giving me this opportunity and all of you for joining us for this second part of a two-part webinar on text complexity, vocabulary, and English language learners. In the first part, which is available on YouTube for those of you who weren't able to view it with us the last time, I describe vocabulary as the critical component in making a text complex. Yes, there are other features of text which contribute to complexity, but without knowing the vast majority of the words in a text, your comprehension is going to be compromised. Vocabulary, in terms of research, is the single best predictor of text comprehension. Now, this is actually good news for us as teachers of English language learners, in that it's possible to teach vocabulary. Other features of text, like syntax, are much more difficult to teach as part of reading. And as a result of the digital age, we now have access to digital databases that really help us clarify what's important to teach with regard to vocabulary. In the first part, I made 3 points. One was that we need to teach vocabulary intentionally and systematically. And we need to use texts that have challenging words, but not ones that overwhelm students with challenging words. The second point was always, always teach words in relation to other words. Words don't exist in isolation. Words in content area texts are connected in conceptual networks such as photosynthesis, chlorophyll, stomata. These words aren't synonyms, but they are conceptually connected. Now, it's a different case in literary or narrative word texts where the words are synonyms. A word such as deceptive is part of a whole network of words, not precisely synonyms, but their nuanced meanings. Words like misleading, dishonest, false, unreliable. And third, the action that I described that we need to take is we need to ensure that our students are reading a lot in class time. You don't get good at anything complex unless you're involved in the task. So you need to use words in text to learn them. So what I suggested is that we had some follow-ups to the first webinar, such as reading the text matters on this topic, and also doing a summary of students, how much they're reading, and also the other picture showed the exceptional expressions, getting kids to begin to have a stance toward this notion that there are lots of potential words that we could be using in literary and narrative texts. In today's session, I'm going to talk about specifically what we can do with words to support students in getting these large generative groups of words that they understand. Now, I want to remind you that I'm focusing on literary and narrative texts because those are the ones that are more vague in terms of guidelines. And what I'm going to do is first talk about how you can have a sense of picking words in text, then I'm going to go on to general lessons and specific lessons. So looking at the general words of vocabulary to pick, what I've been emphasizing in this workshop is that content area specialists are very explicit about that 10% of the vocabulary that makes content area text unique. It's the words in narrative texts that draw on large groups of text, and most often they're concepts that students already know, but they are words that they don't necessarily know. So that's the vocabulary that we're looking at. And what I'm going to show you is a set of slides from the Common Course exemplars for grades 6 to 8. Now, I want to emphasize that I use these as exemplars, and exemplars mean examples, not mandates. And my reason for 6 to 8 is I think it's a good stage that illustrates what we do in the elementary school as well as the high school. And 6 to 8 is always a critical period for English language learners because their success in middle school is really going to determine their future in high school and whether in fact they stay in school. So what I want you to do when you look at these texts is to take a look at them and to think about. Remember, I can show you 50 words according to copyright guidelines. And so that means however many hard words there are here, you need to multiply by 2. But what words might be challenging for English language learners in this text? When we do an analysis of the frequency of words, the likelihood that students will have seen these words before, these are the words that come up. So what you're seeing here is that there are about 8 words per every 100. That's a fairly heavy level, and you can look at these words and see that most of them, at least in this text, are multisyllabic words. In the next text, take a look at this. So this is the book 11, also part of the 6 to 8 exemplars. In this text, and remember the words in yellow are words that come from the 90%, the 4,000 simple word families that account for 90% of the words in text. In this text, it's regarded to be an exemplar of a complex text, but as you see here, it's much less heavy in terms of its demands. This is a text that I would call more accessible, but also a complex one. What about this text? As you see here, there's a complex word, a hard word that's repeated several times, which we hope would actually make the task a little bit easier. And as we see here, names also contribute to the complexity of text. And I'm going to argue especially for English language learners who find some of these names difficult to pronounce. This text illustrates that sometimes the words can be more archaic words, like how this author is spelling the word, or dialectic words like OLE, or they can be small words like fig or the word yonder. So sometimes all complex texts, all complex words aren't necessarily created equally. And then this is the last one I'm going to show you. Okay, so this text, in the first one that I showed you, this one has about 10 words per 100, 10 hard words per 100. And you get the idea here. There's an unusual name. There are some multisyllabic words. And even though I've described to you that it's really a great idea to stay with accessible text, I'm going to work with you in the rest of the session on using vocabulary or teaching vocabulary related to Greek mythology, specifically the Iliad. And this particular book is a version of the Iliad for middle school children. At one point or another, students are going to need to deal with the Western canon. And I want to show you how we do general instruction to provide a solid base for students once they get to these books. So I'm actually saying that we're doing lessons at all times that are preparing our students for the vocabularies of different kinds of genres, topics, and authors. And there are 4 specific areas that this general vocabulary instruction needs to occur in. The first has to do with names. As I said, especially for English language learners, they can be confused and kind of stopped in their efforts when there's a heavy dose of names. And the Greek myths are a fantastic example where the authors use an inordinate number of names. So what I've done in this example, so I've taken words or names, and these are not all the names from black ships from this version of the Iliad, but some of them. And I've actually wanted to show students that you're going to be confronted with a lot of names. We're going to work on the pronunciations of some of them, but I realized even after I had done this that there were lots that I had missed. So what we're going to want you to do is when you come to these names, keep having some kind of a strategy. So make up a pronunciation and be okay with the pronunciation you have when you come across that name. And some of these characters are going to be much more critical than others. In this particular part of the text that we're going to read in a couple of weeks, these are the characters that are actually very, very critical. Okay, but I want to point out to you, I want you to be ready for the fact that there are going to be lots of unusual names, and there are also lots of unusual names of places. Okay, so and this is a really critical thing as we think of getting kids ready for some of the assessments, because assessments often use magazine articles. And magazine writers, journalists, often use a lot of proper nouns to give their texts interest and meaning. So we need to be ready. We need to have a stance. It's okay if you can't pronounce it, but focus on the names that are really critical and be sure that you remember who those characters are or what those places are. I also suggest that we draw sentences from the text that students are going to read, or there's another source if people have the time to do that, and that's Google Ngram Viewer, where you can type in a word and get the use of that word in sentences that go through the English language at least as long to the point where they have actually put those texts into databases. And I think on Google Ngram it goes to about 1840. So you can have examples where kids can actually be applying some of these names. So if we can't pronounce that name in the first sentence, what's the point that we really want to take away from here? Okay, we know the name Helen, and we know that she in fact was married to someone else, and that person may come up in the story, may not. The way that the Greek myths are written, sometimes we never ever hear of that person again, as is the case in the second sentence, Paris's brother. Okay, so what I've suggested is we need to make kids aware that different authors use different kinds of names. For example, in Dragon Wings, there are also references to the names of the characters as they are in Chinese. Not the actual Chinese words, but their Chinese names. So we need to have a flexibility and awareness that this is going to happen. The second thing we need to do as part of general instruction, and I'm saying this needs to be an ongoing part of our programs. Some of you are going to ask precisely how much. I'm going to suggest that at least 10 to 15% of our English language arts should be devoted to very comprehensive and intentional vocabulary instruction, perhaps more. But we need to be setting a base. So to be able to deal with these complex texts with a lot of vocabulary, we need to have knowledge with which we're going into those texts. The second kind of knowledge that we want to really systematically work on, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this in New York City with Noni Lasso and also Michael Kiefer, who's at NYU, but we want to make kids aware of the morphological families in English. And as we know, we have 3 layers from which English words come, and those layers each function differently in how they're generating words and how they're making new words for kids. For example, in the Anglo-Saxon German layer, we make new words by compounding. In the Romance layer, they're typically derivatives, and sometimes we take a derivative and put it with another word to make a phrase, but we don't compound in the same way we do in German. Now in Greek, it's compounding of words that are root words. And I actually propose to you that this triangle of how English functions is something that kids need to be acquainted with from at least 3rd grade on. They should be aware that we're now working on the ways in which new words are generated in the Greek language, in the Greek part of English. This is a small part of English, but it's a really critical part of the technical and informational aspect of English. So one of the words that comes up in Greek mythology is the word pan, which means all, every, whole, like the pantheon. And when we come up with a word like that, we also want to look at the whole body of words, the whole family of words that you could be using. Now, I haven't generated some sentences with these words, but once again, We can draw on sentences from the book students are reading. There's also the possibility of the Google Ngram viewer, and I'm certain in the years to come we're going to have more databases like that that allow us to give our kids lots of exposure to the words that we're working with in our vocabulary programs. Okay? But what I'm really emphasizing here is that developing this stance, this expectation that words also are morphological families, meaning families, concept families, but also in morphological families which share part of the meaning of the words. The third aspect of a systematic vocabulary instruction has to do with picturable concepts. All of us, adults, children, learn words that are picturable, that are concrete, much more readily than we learn abstract words. And what we need to be thinking is, there's been some tension around prior knowledge, background knowledge, in terms of some of the interpretations of the Common Core. And we've been told that we should really be looking at the text as a source of information. And that is important. But it's often the case that students don't have the underlying concept to understand what's happening in the piece of literature. Take, for example, Secret Garden, which has to do with the Victorian age, when England was a colonial power and a little girl comes back from India where her parents have been working for the colonial government, and she's put into the care of servants, which was something that happened in some well-to-do Victorian families. Some of these notions that come from India, and also some of the ideas of the Yorkshire landscape that this little girl is part of, are really important in understanding the story. And I'm suggesting that we can develop some of these ideas through pictures. And in fact, there's a very, very strong research on the contributions that concept development through pictures can have with English learners. So the students often have the concepts, they just don't have the English terms for them. And the Greek mythology is a good example where there are some ideas that can be represented in pictures that can really support students in understanding the context of these stories. So we've put together a set of these pictures for you about Greek mythology, and I'll give you the URL later where you can find them. But this is the kind of thing that I think we really have to be looking at when we're teaching particular themes. How can groups of teachers be putting some of these picture sets together? Because we know for English language learners, they're critical for understanding context and also purpose. So why was Olympus so important to the Greeks? It's the highest mountain in Greece. And it was something that from a lot of different points in the country could be seen. And so a lot of the mythology, a lot of the stories the ancient people had were about these creatures who lived on top of this high mountain. Here's an illustration of the pantheon, the major gods. So there were 12 of them. I could have labeled these. I didn't want to confuse the whole idea. I just wanted to convey the idea that there were representations of these gods and goddesses, and that these beings actually play a very critical role in the decisions and the activities of people in the Greek myths. Another very nicely picturable word is the word armor. I thought this was pretty amazing. This is supposed to be a Greek armor, and if you think of just how heavy that is, that would be an interesting thing for kids to realize as these people are going to battle, exactly how they're equipped. Oracles and soothsayers are an important part of Greek myths, and sometimes it can be really useful just to have some illustration to start making some of this information more explicit. It's hard to illustrate the word keel. Oh, and by the way, you're going to see here, I've consistently, I haven't put the syllable accents, but I've consistently divided these words into syllables because it's very critical to be supporting kids in parsing multisyllabic words. But when you think about, and especially in the Trojan War, the use of the sea or the presence of the sea is a really important part of a lot of these stories. And having some idea of the kinds of ships, the galleys that these people were sailing on is an important part of the story. Here's an example. We hear about the citadel being an important part, at least in the Trojan War, and battlements. Having some understanding of what that's like. And what's critical around the citadel, right, is that it's the village or the town is around it, and the military base is separated, and that's an important part to understand, especially when the Trojan horse is brought into that space. And it's also important to know, now, the ancient Troy that the Greeks were battling with was in what is present-day Turkey, and it's actually remnants of it were located in the 19th century. But again, having some sense of the distance that these people traveled is an important part of the story, and we can convey that to students. And finally, the Palladium is critical in the mythology, and we can also support students in understanding that we often use these words for Greek gods or concepts from mythology in naming things like chemical elements. A lot of the asteroids are named after characters from the Iliad. So the vocabulary isn't just specific to these stories, it's also part of lots of other aspects of our culture. Okay, so now the final part of vocabulary instruction has to do with instruction of prolific groups of words. In our last session, I talked about the fact that stories, writers of stories, keep using particular concepts in stories. Like, concepts usually have some movement. They typically have some emotion and some communication. The author doesn't keep using the same word again and again, which is what makes literary quality. You expect authors to not use the word go consistently. If you think about a series called Dick and Jane that many of the baby boomers learned to read with, certain words were repeated over and over and over again, which really made those stories not of high literary quality. But in a highly literate text, an author uses these words, but uses nuanced synonyms for the concepts. Okay, so the specific word isn't used, but the concept is there. And students vitally need to have the anticipation, and this really comes through their own writing, that good writing, good literature has these constructs in them, but that there are very different words that are used to represent them. So they need the anticipation, and they need to see lots of examples. Now, one of the things in Greek mythology is that there is an enormous amount of action in these stories. And many of the words are fairly rare Anglo-Saxon words that, especially for kids who are Spanish speakers, are going to be some very strange words like jab and heave and tow. Or the word yank, which actually has multiple meanings, or wrench. So what I'm suggesting here is that we want to do semantic maps, find sentences. This is an example of a sentence that I found in Google Ngram Viewer, where the word nudge was used. So this is the same principle that I was discussing last time with exceptional expressions. And now we want to show students that we're going to read this genre of text in which there's just an enormous amount of movement and action. There's a lot of military action. There's a lot of pushing and shoving. And the author doesn't just keep using the word push or pull or shove. There are going to be a lot of these often little words that are going to contribute to making the text potentially more challenging unless we're prepared for this kind of vocabulary. Okay, the final part of this webinar series has to do with what we do when we're teaching a specific text. So what I've been describing here is developing a stance toward names, developing morphological knowledge. Also talked about developing concept knowledge that's part of literature through picturable sets of words. We call them word pictures. And I've also talked about developing these semantic networks. You can't develop all the semantic networks, but also a stance for them. And now I'm going to show you how I work on a specific chapter from the Iliad. It's called the Wooden Horse. And I'm suggesting a 4-step strategy. The first step has to do with our knowledge as teachers. And this is something that often hasn't been publicized widely in our educational press. But we need a sense, and I've done something similar for elementary school students, and for those of you who teach high school, it actually turns out that reading rate stays fairly stable after the middle grades, unfortunately. And that's something that we really need to think and work on. But what I'm showing you here is that from the best knowledge that we have, even students at the 10th, 20th, 30th, 40th, and 50th percentiles are fairly accurate. So if you look at the last column of accuracy, on a text with 9% hard words, so that means out of every 100 words, there are 9 hard ones. A massive sample, it's about 5,000 students, showed that the students were accurate at the 10th percentile. It was only at about the 2nd and 3rd percentile that accuracy dropped to about 88%. But students aren't reading very quickly. Okay, we speak as adults at about 150 words a minute, and that appears to be for silent reading. Actually, that's a fairly slow rate, but for oral reading, and that this test was actually done orally, you want students to be reading about that, within that range. So the 50th percentile kids are about where you want. So what we're seeing is that the students can recognize the words. They just are reading very slowly. And it's kind of a catch-22, right? They read slowly, they don't want to read more. Keith Stanovich used a Bible verse for that to describe the Matthew effect. Those who have get better, and those who don't get worse. But what we want to do as the first step of reading with our students is to be explicit about the challenge and the fact that we've done a lot of foundational lessons to support them in getting ready for this. I am suggesting that from about 3rd or 4th grade on, we're actually showing our students some examples of these texts, of saying, you know the majority of the words in this text. There are going to be some words that you don't know. In fact, you can use the words around those words to help you. In some cases, like avenge the insult, that would be hard. And we'll come back and talk about some of those aspects at the end of our reading. And what we might do is we might chunk this chapter. In the case of the wooden the wooden horse, I actually chunked it into sections of about 800 words. But what I want to show kids is that they have a responsibility for doing the reading. Until we get our students to read more, they're never going to get any better. And we are going to need to show them that this is actually a doable task. It is challenging, but you're up to the challenge, and we've also given you the background skills to be able to deal with it. The second part of before reading is we need to provide purpose-setting questions, which, and this is where the close reading idea comes in, we want to use vocabulary that they're going to read in the text and help to define it as we set purpose. So in this section of the wooden horse, the Greeks turned to cunning to win the war. So in the section you're going to read, so it's about 750 words, 800 words. That means it's about 5 minutes of reading. That's a doable task. You've got the skills to do it. You're going to be reading to identify elements that involve some deceit. So Odysseus is given this divine plan, and it's very full of cunning. Your job is to read this section to find out what some of those elements were and why, in fact, they needed to have this plan. Okay, after we've read, we want to return to that purpose-setting question. And we actually want to return to the text and have kids share parts of the text to illustrate what was full of cunning. And then we want to ask additional questions that support students returning to the text. Do you see the importance of the returning to the text? Is it helps us attend to some of that challenging vocabulary. And it also helps them to do additional reading. So they're seeing what some of the words were that were difficult and having a chance to actually get some fluency with those words. So in this case, the author uses the term unfolded to describe how Odysseus presented his plans to his fellow Greeks. Why might the author have used that term rather than the word delivered? Or could the author have used the word delivered? So let's go back to that phrase or that part of the text and see what other verbs that author could have used. Okay, so this is an example of close reading. And a final part of the reading following the text is to do semantic networks of very key words. Not all the words in the text, as I said, in this section of about 2,400 words, right? If there are 10 hard words per 100, that means that there are almost 250 hard words. A lot of them are names. A lot of them are these strange little verbs we've talked about. But there are also some critical words like the word cunning. And it turns out cunning is a crucial term in relation to Greek mythology. There are books written about wisdom and cunning in Greek mythology. So we want to get a sense of what cunning really means, and especially what it means in terms of Greek mythology. So the Greeks really valued inventiveness, but in terms of the cunning, as was the case with the wooden horse, there's always a sense of divine intervention. The gods are helping these humans be more full of cleverness, be more subtle, be more crafty, be shrewd. So this notion is a central one both to the story, so it has to do with comprehension. So I'm not just picking random words. So do you see that in this context here, I'm not focusing on some of those action words. I prepared the stage for the reading earlier by working on some of the background for that. But in this case, I'm working on a really central notion in the story. So in summary, what I've proposed today is that as teachers, we need to have a sense of potentially challenging words and stories, and how those words are central to the comprehension of the text. So we could return to those words from, for example, roll of thunder, and words like yonder and old fig tree are really not central to the text comprehension. So I might say that's a much more accessible text that I might use earlier in the year. And as I'm developing the base for understanding names and morphological families and prolific groups of synonyms, and also developing sets of concepts through pictures. I understand that certain stories among the collection that we have available for to instruct are vary considerably in terms of their challenge of vocabulary. The second point is we need to be very systematic in how we conduct lessons on the critical features of text. These lessons use the content of text that we're teaching, but they're also separated from the comprehension that we're doing with those texts. And to me, that's a very important distinction. When students are reading and taking responsibility for the text, that's what they need to be doing. And we need to be in that final step, the 4-step process. It's at that point where we assume that this generic or overall instruction that we've been doing with nouns, morphological families, the concepts, and the prolific groups of synonyms is paying off, and students can be attending to words such as cunning and critical words that tell you what is going to happen in the story, why it's happening, and so on. So I want to remind you that we have lots of resources for you at Text Project, and that all of these resources are available for free. We're a not-for-profit. We hope that you take advantage of some of them. And we've generated a handful of questions to start out with, and then Stella is going to join me and ask a few more, so we've got some time to do that. I want to also remind you that Stella and her colleagues have been looking at the questions you've posted as the presentations have occurred, and I've been answering some of these questions and adding them to the YouTube site, and I also know that they're being added to the New York City school site or the Office of English Language Learners site. So I want to remind you that the question about motivation in reading complex text is one that I've provided some information on, and I'm going to continue to answer questions over the next couple of months. Some of these questions are challenging ones, especially ones about motivation. But one of the questions I anticipated people might have is there a website with sets of pictures for other themes and book titles? The particular set that I use today, we've put onto our website for you to use. I would welcome, we have some guidelines here at Text Project for identifying these pictures. In the elementary grades, we've got some teachers in some other school districts looking for them. I don't know of a website that provides comprehensive sets of pictures. And sometimes just using Google Pictures, sometimes we're advised that you can just type in a word and you can get pictures for that word. I find that you can get some pictures that you really have to sift through the pictures. You can find some very inappropriate pictures to be using in school settings. So we've vetted our pictures pretty closely. I'd welcome people who are interested in vetting pictures with us, for us, to contact us. We'll give the information address at the end of the presentation. But I think that this is a very critical part of the instruction of ELs, is that they are given the opportunity to develop some background, the context and the purpose for things, for example, like Winston Churchill's speech, Blood, Toil, Tears, and Sweat, to get some idea of what it looked like at the when he was speaking in Parliament. We can get pictures like that, and I think that makes a huge difference in terms of students understanding about what's being said in the texts and also why it's important to read those texts. I describe middle graders, even at the 10 percentile, as being able to recognize most words, although I was clear that they don't necessarily recognize them quickly. What percentage of those students in that study were English learners? The study that I was showing you was done primarily, about 40% of the students were in the West, in California, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon, Washington, and we can be confident that at least 20% of the sample was were students who were English language learners. Another source of information is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And on the 2011 study, they showed and 10% of their sample on the NAEP in 2011 were English language learners. Of the English language learners, 24% were in the group below the 25th percentile and only 2% above the 75th percentile. So what we're seeing then is most of the students who are English language learners being somewhere between the 25th and 75th percentile. So the point is they're not the slowest readers. They have a fairly good handle on word recognition, but they're not reading fluently enough to keep pace with the ideas that they need to be reading in text. The way people often describe it is by the time kids get to the ends of some of the sentences, they can't remember what they read at the beginning because there's so much, they're reading so slowly, their processing isn't keeping up. And by the way, this NAEP study is a silent reading test, and it's the test that is really the model for what people in the two assessment consortium around the Common Core are using. So I think we can, and the passages are about 700 to 1,800 words on average, I think, long. So you can anticipate that that this is a fairly accurate representation. So I'm suggesting that the data about word recognition also applies to English language learners, but we have to keep remembering that if you don't read a lot, you don't get much better at it. And if people do the reading for you because you don't want to read or you say you can't read, it just is a real cycle of increased problems, which is why I'm really emphasizing that we've got to have some tough conversations with the kids. That doesn't mean that they get challenging text day in and day out. There have to be some times, and I was showing you that there's a real range of vocabulary demands in some of these texts that are regarded as complex. So we're not going to give them the complex diet every single day. There's going to be a range in it, but they do have to understand that they're going to encounter words. And they need to understand that it's probably at a rate of about 5 to 10 hard words per 100, and that we're working on the strategies underlying that. How much class time should be spent on general vocabulary instruction? This is a difficult question, and I was suggesting maybe a day, one period. If you have 5 60-minute periods, the equivalent of approximately a period a week, that's just a hypothesis. Please, I'm just putting it out there, and I'd love to hear some responses. This time could be spread, across the school week. I think that's probably a better thing to do. Starting each session as a warm-up of doing a particular kind of vocabulary instruction, I think, is probably better than spending a whole class period on it. But I am suggesting that we need to do a lot of it. We need to be specific about it. There is a curriculum that underlies vocabulary, just as there is a curriculum that underlies mathematics. And we've often been very unclear about what that curriculum is. And finally, on what basis did you decide which words are hard? Some of the words you identified you didn't identify them, and they seem challenging, like memory. That's a good point, and the way in which I actually identify words is through the frequency with which they occur in the written language. So a word like memory is actually substantially more frequent than a word like insult or a word like fig or yonder. And in all likelihood, also because memory is part of a morphological family like memorize, memorizing, the likelihood that you've seen that word by the middle grades is much higher than the likelihood that you've seen some of the other words that I showed, like beckoned. So that's the basis on which we determine the hard words. The list of common words, by the way, the 4,000 simple word families, is available at Text Project. So Stella, I'm going to turn things over to you if there are some additional questions.
Yes, thank you. Actually, one of the questions that we received is, do students need to be a specific language level proficiency for teachers to use morphology as a means to develop vocabulary? And I know you spoke about the importance of teaching morphology very explicitly starting grade 3, but how does that work with students who are at the beginning levels of language proficiency, or does that stand true for them as well?
That's a very critical and important question. And Stella, that's a question that I'm going to get some more background information on.
Okay.
The kind of morphology I was showing with pandemonium and that kind of morphology, I think could be done with students who are at fairly early stages of learning English. When there's a very meaningful unit, when the unit that you're teaching is like an inflected ending or a suffix where the meaning is a lot less obvious, I think that would be much more difficult if you didn't have a very good, if you weren't at an appropriate level of speaking English. But I think you can do some things with compound words, the German kind of compound words like, like greenhouse or doghouse, especially if the things are fairly, I think that could happen earlier. So there might actually be a developmental level in terms of morphology, but I will find that out and give a response on the YouTube responses.
Thank you, Freddy. Another question that came out to us is, do you have any suggestions about chunking the text that does not naturally divide by topic? And you also spoke about the importance of chunking the text, especially when we work with challenging text in order to make it accessible for all students of all language proficiency. But sometimes it becomes very difficult to chunk the text that does not have that natural division. So any suggestions about how we as teachers can attend to that task?
As part of an earlier version of this presentation, I didn't want to overwhelm people. I had done an example of how I would chunk that chapter. And again, I can provide that in follow-up materials. But let me tell you how I made the decisions, because it wasn't in this chapter, it was about a 2,200 word chapter. And how I think about chunking is I want to be sure in a 50-minute period that my students have read an appropriate amount of text. So I was clear that in the challenging text, I wanted to give them about 750 words. And then I also wanted to give them about 750 words in more accessible texts that I had pulled, like from an encyclopedia article or a magazine article. So I looked in the chapter to make chunks so that I could achieve my goal. Because see, I have another goal. That is that the kids need to be reading a certain amount every day. So for English language learners and kids of poverty and students who often, are among those kids in the bottom 25% or even 40% percentile, they need to be doing an extensive amount of reading. So I did the best I could in making a chunk where some action stopped around the amount that I wanted them to read. So I'm saying I wanted the kids to be reading at least 10 minutes a day, both in terms of the precursor reading, getting some background for the topic, and also reading in the text and then doing rereading. So in my case, it was arbitrary. I don't know anybody who's really written about this. Yeah. And I also want all of you to know that this is my best professional judgment of when I'm making these suggestions about amount of reading. But we have to be thinking about how much these students are reading. And if we're saying today you're going to read 2,200 hard, challenging texts, and then we're going to talk about it for the rest of the week, I would rather chunk it and also give them some text from some sources. I've gone on to, actually, in working on this project with all of you in New York City, I've begun using the Encyclopedia Britannica website, which has some student-friendly articles. And a lot of those, and it is actually fairly reasonable. I don't know what access some of the schools have, but that's something that I found to be fairly reasonable. EBSCO is available through lots of school sites. but sometimes those articles can be all over the map. But I'm looking also for kids to be doing some background reading on the topic. So I hope that that gets to your answer to your question, Stella.
It does. Thank you. Thank you, Freddy. And I don't know, do we have time for one more question?
I think
or
we do.
We do, okay.
We do.
So and this question again is about English language learners who are at the beginning stages of language development. And as you can see, that seems to be a burning issue for us here in New York City. In regards to providing definitions through the use of cluster maps, how do we support our beginner English language learners who may find some of these definitions challenging, as the examples provide to understand the nuances of these words are not comprehensible? Do we maybe use more pictures to support this group, or do we let them read and struggle as they are trying to identify the meaning behind the definitions?
Excellent question, and an important thing for us to be thinking about. I would propose that here too there's a developmental sequence, and I would lay a foundation with lots of these word picture groups. We have a set of word pictures related to concepts at Text Project, but I think that's a very good point, that the semantic networks should be fairly small. In other words, rather than having 10 examples as I gave, possibly 2 or 3, for the word go, and to really attend to some of the simpler words that students know in English. And I would really emphasize at the beginning stages that the word picture maps, the word picture sets are absolutely essential. And then use those to expand the meanings of a handful of words with maybe only 2 or 3 examples. So I wasn't sensitive to that, and I apologize for that, but I think that's a very important thing for us to be thinking about. Stella, there's some very good research on the use of these picturable concept sets. The real question is, where do we find them? And I think it's an important thing for us to be thinking about in the future. So should I just run through the rest of just to let people know that these slides are going to be available? I think they already are.
Yeah,
the recording
definitely
will be available in at least perhaps sooner than a week, and we'll continue to add these Q&As. These are great questions. I wish I could just spend all of my time coming up with some responses to them. And here's the email if some people want to join us in doing some of these picture searches. So thank you, Stella. If you
so the archived version of this event will also be available on our DOE OELL website, and we will also send an email confirmation with this message. And finally, we want to thank you, Freddy, for your time and sharing your expertise once again with us. And also thank you, all of you who have joined us today. I know that we are all leaving this webinar with new and inspired thoughts on how to help our English language learners in New York City.
Thank you.
Thank you.